It is easy to get overwhelmed or distracted by the sheer volume of sensational news coming from south of the border, and it can make it hard for journalists to break through the noise with serious, complex stories. But American journalist Jeremy Scahill has developed a real knack for doing that, particularly as a founding editor of the online news platform The Intercept, and now with his podcast, Intercepted. And we're pleased to welcome Jeremy Scahill to our studio to bring his country's political turmoil into some focus for us. Think you can do it?
I'll give it my best shot.
It is a tall task. Here's what you had to say on your podcast a few days after Donald Trump was elected the 45th president of the United States. People are hurting. People that are genuinely progressives felt like this was a referendum on the legacy of the Democrats, the institutional Democrats' position on trade. That certainly wasn't the only issue. Race, sexism, all of those things played a role. But I do think that Bernie Sanders tapped into the same kind of emotion that Trump did in a kind of parallel universe. And I think that that's worth talking about. So that's what we're going to do here. What did Trump tap into?
Well, what I think is interesting, there's still a lot of analysis about like how the hell did this happen? How is Donald Trump the president of the United States? You know, this guy was a reality TV host, widely sort of viewed as a kind of buffoon or a charlatan, no political experience whatsoever. And you know, there's a lot of focus on angry working class white people. You know, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. What I find more fascinating, and what the quote you just refers to, is that you had people that voted twice for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. And it's like, wait.
How does that happen?
How do you have two elections where they're voting for the first black president of the United States and then voting for a guy who has the open endorsement of neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and is completely tone deaf on racial issues, to put it mildly? What is the common factor there? The common factor was this perception you're voting for an outsider. You're rejecting establishment politics in the United States. And I think a lot of the people who voted for Donald Trump, that also voted for Barack Obama, were people that were looking for a circuit breaker, someone that was going to stop business as usual. So it didn't necessarily matter the ideas that Trump was promoting as much as he wasn't a Hillary Clinton or a Jeb Bush.
Does that go some way towards explaining why your first choice might have been Trump, but a lot of people's second choice was Bernie Sanders, even though ideologically they seem a long way apart?
If you look at some of the states that were crucial to Trump's election, including Wisconsin, in my home state, very near Canada, you saw that there were people that were Bernie Sanders supporters, and then they voted for Donald Trump. What I think explains some of that has to do with the deindustrialization of the American workforce, where you have cities that used to have massive auto manufacturing, blue-collar jobs that were union jobs that paid well, jobs that have been shipped off to Mexico. I know in Canada, too, the impacts of NAFTA are felt. And you have a left-wing analysis of NAFTA that is about supporting workers' rights throughout the Western Hemisphere, and the idea that if you export jobs from Canada or the United States down to Mexico or elsewhere in Central and South America, that you're pitting workers against workers and driving wages down in both of those places. That's more of the left-wing analysis. The right-wing analysis comes, and this is what Trump presented, is sort of this anti-globalist agenda that his former top strategist Steve Bannon was a big fan of. And I think that Trump railing against NAFTA or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it didn't matter what his analysis was. The idea that he was tapping into this idea that the American worker is being screwed by these deals was, I think, a big part of that crossover from the Bernie Sanders team. And Hillary Clinton is the epitome of a globalist politician in the eyes of Steve Bannon, but also a right-wing Democrat in the eyes of many people on the left that were Bernie Sanders supporters.
I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here, though, and say that I think there is some overlap between Trump's beliefs and yours. Distrust of the mainstream media, anger towards powerful elites, a sense that the game is rigged and therefore the average guy doesn't have a fair shot. I mean, that informs a lot of your journalism too, does it not?
Well, I would say, if you were just asking me that and not putting the comparison to Trump, I would say yes, those are crucial parts of what I think is wrong with the American political landscape. But I don't believe that Trump is an honest broker in any of this. I think that his attacks against the news media are generally attacks against exposés or telling the truth about something rather than engaging in government propaganda or being lapdogs for the powerful. Trump's attacks on a free press in the United States are very dangerous.
He called them enemies of the state.
He's called them enemies of the state. Really, right now, what he's doing raises, I think, very serious constitutional questions in the U.S. He is openly questioning whether the broadcasting license of one of the biggest networks in the U.S., NBC News, should be put under review. The reason I'm hesitating on sort of saying, oh, yes, you're absolutely right, Trump and I share these things, is because I think
Trump, but his base. I mean, there's a significant chunk of his base that you presumably have simpatico with.
Yes, and well, let me put this a different way. I share in the analysis that we have a bankrupt media culture in the United States, and my current analysis of what's happening is that you have major TV personalities in the United States, major publications openly calling the President of the United States a liar. Now, I think that is a much welcome development. But my fear is that people feel like Trump's an anomaly and therefore it's okay to do this. But the next time there's one of the responsible managers of empire back in power, we're not going to say that anymore. I mean, we were sort of saying this for years, like, why wouldn't you call Bush and his people liars for the Iraq stuff? Why didn't you call torture for so many years? When you were using their propagandistic phrases, enhanced interrogation, et cetera. Now it's like the gloves are off and they're just pummeling away at Trump. And it's not that I feel sorry for Trump. It's that they're dripping in hypocrisy, these big, powerful media institutions. And I hope, I'm not confident, but I hope that this sticks and that if a Hillary Clinton type person becomes president or the Democrats regain power at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that the same standard is applied to them as it is to Trump.
It's interesting because the can I use this word, the viciousness of the coverage against Donald Trump, or the aggressiveness, maybe that's a better word, was not used against Barack Obama, despite the fact that Obama, I think it's fair to say, over his 8 years, was way worse for media than anything Trump has done so far. Trump's popped off, but he hasn't actually done anything yet. Is that fair to say?
Well, you had powerful right-wing news organizations like Breitbart or the Drudge Report, which remains one of the top-read news sites, if you can call it a news site, in the United States. So I think depending on where you're looking, there was a lot of tough coverage of Barack Obama from the right that I thought was incredibly unfair and defamatory. The stuff about, is he really an American? Stuff about Michelle Obama, really grotesque racist attacks on her. But when you're talking about like the so-called mainstream of American journalism, kid gloves on Obama compared to what they're doing with Trump. And it's not that I feel sympathy for Trump. It's that some of the very entities that are attacking Trump were completely asleep at the wheel while Obama was authorizing the drone killing of American citizens, while Obama was using the 1917 Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers. Jim Risen, the great legendary New York Times reporter, multiple Pulitzer Prizes, waged a multi-year legal battle against Obama's Justice Department. The Justice Department was trying to force him to snitch on confidential sources of his, whistleblowers.
And where was the excoriating coverage over that?
Oh, it was almost not covered at all,
right,
outside of a kind of small circle of, sort of straight shooting journalists. But it wasn't, this was not a mega scandal.
Okay, back on the path here.
Yeah.
Is Donald Trump's victory proof of the failure of liberal politics?
No, I wouldn't say that, because I think that there is no such thing as liberal politics in the sense that you're meaning it in institutional politics in the United States. These two political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, share much more in common with each other than they do with average working Americans. Hillary Clinton, she's a neoliberal empire politician who is a very pugnacious, hawkish person from both Senate, her time in the U.S. Senate, where she supported militaristic policies, the Patriot Act,
Iraq invasion.
The Iraq invasion. She's now recanted, although it's a sorta culpa, not a mea culpa. Donald Trump is, I think, an exaggerated version of empire politics in the United States. He says things that racists and white supremacists have decided no longer they're going to say out loud. But you're asking about liberal politics. The Democratic Party is not a left institution. There are leftists that permeate certain aspects of the Democratic Party, but these are empire politicians. And I think that the Bernie Sanders candidacy, if Bernie Sanders had decided to run as an independent candidate, it would have shattered the Democratic Party, and I think it would have been a good thing because we need multi-party system in the United States, not just two parties. And I think it was a real lost opportunity. The catch-22 for Bernie Sanders is he would have been blamed then for Trump winning. But Trump did win anyway, and Hillary Clinton was the candidate.
Well, Trump won anyway, but let me put 2 points on the record, which everybody knows. Number one,
he didn't
Hillary,
win
Hillary Clinton got 3 million more votes than did Donald Trump. And the other thing is, if you, and I know you can't do this, but let's do this for argument's sake, you could take a small handful of states, half a dozen states, and the margin of victory by Trump in those states was so small that in a country of 330 million people, it's a matter of 100,000 votes here and there, right? That could have completely turned the election around another way. So are the reports of the death of liberalism in the United States exaggerated?
No, in fact, I would say I reject the idea that that we have like any kind of truly left politics in the establishment Democratic Party. One of the things I think is really a positive of Trump's victory, and there's very few of them, is I think there is a real debate now in the United States about what it means to truly challenge authority and power. One of the fastest growing political movements in the United States is a political party that is largely led by young people called the Democratic Socialists of America. Their ranks are swelling right now. No, they're not. They're not going to be able to compete on a national level at this point. But there are several candidates endorsed by Democratic Socialists of America that may well win congressional seats in 2018. To me, that's a positive development. Bernie Sanders also may well run again. I mean, he's very old, you know, in terms of...
he's only 74 or 5 or something like that.
He's old in the context of American politics. I mean, he would be, you know, if not the oldest, one of the oldest people ever to serve as president. There's a lot of ways in which I love Bernie Sanders, but I don't think, I think it's a mistake to get into cult of personality politics. The point of Bernie Sanders' campaign was not Bernie Sanders. It was an incredible moment where you realize, hey, these things that I believe, that guy is saying them. And why aren't those things ever said on TV? Why aren't they said by major politicians? Trump and Bernie Sanders were saying things in their own ways that a lot of people agree with but don't ever see on television. And I think that's why both of them surged. Hillary Clinton didn't even want to mention Bernie Sanders' name for months until he started getting media coverage.
But it's interesting. Sanders is not a Democrat, but he ran for the Democratic nomination.
He's a Democratic Socialist, actually, and that's part of why that party is growing.
But Trump is not a Republican, and he got the Republican nomination.
Trump is
two real outsiders trying to get in there.
For sure, and Hillary Clinton had to really play dirty with Bernie Sanders to stop him from winning the nomination. I think Bernie would have won.
The presidency?
Yes.
Had he won the nomination?
I think he would have won. Because for the exact reason that you point out, the margin of victory for Trump in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, a couple of other states, the people that went for Trump that were Bernie supporters, I think almost all Democrats would have gone for Bernie if he had won the nomination, and he would have stolen a bunch of people from Trump. Now, Hillary's people would say, aha, that's proof that Bernie's people are misogynist, socialist, bros, whatever. But it's BS. I mean, I really think that at the end of the day, what Sanders did, it shook the Democratic Party, but it should have shattered it as we understand it today. That's what the Tea Party did with the Republican Party. And Steve Bannon, who is an evil genius, he said this, that the Democratic Party is never going to thrive until they have their own civil war, like the Republican Party did. And Bannon's going to run candidates against, I think, almost every senator in the U.S. that's up for re-election in 2018, except Ted Cruz. He's a Canadian, by the way, Ted Cruz. No, that's part of the meme about him. He's also the Zodiac killer. There's all these memes about Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz is safe, but Bannon's going to run his own platform. What does that mean? It means that the Republican Party has an ongoing civil war, and that's part of why Donald Trump won.
Let's do another quote. This is the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates on your podcast recently. And a quote from his new book, "We Were 8 Years in Power." The symbolic power of Barack Obama's presidency, that whiteness was no longer strong enough to prevent peons from taking up residence in the castle, assaulted the most deeply rooted notions of white supremacy and instilled fear in its adherents and beneficiaries. And it was that fear that gave the symbols Donald Trump deployed, the symbols of racism, enough potency to make him president and thus put him in a position to injure the world. To what extent do you think a white supremacist backlash to a black president also contributes to the election of Donald Trump?
I think that was one of a handful of key factors here. America remains a nation centered around the principles of broad principles of white supremacy. If you look at the way financial institutions are set up, if you look at the rates of pay, if you look at acts of police violence, America is at its core still a very racist country in my view. And I say this, I'm saying this as a white man who hasn't lived the experience of a black person in the United States. Where I disagree with Ta-Nehisi Coates' analysis is that I think that Donald Trump is the logical product of our political system rather than any sort of an anomaly. I think that Donald Trump is an extroverted, buffoonish version of a lot of American presidents. And I think he's saying things out loud that they've decided in the year 2017 are not very couth to say. And I think that's part of the appeal of Trump. It's the same reason why in the US people like Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck became big figures. They're shock jocks. Trump is the epitome of a shock jock turned politician. And I think that people also on a surface level feel like Trump's a billionaire. He'll know how to solve our economic problems. And you look at what this clown is saying. The other day he's talking about how the stock market, it's at record levels, therefore I've wiped out the national debt. It's as though he doesn't even understand basic economic principle. The guy doesn't know, for instance, that he's president of the people of the Virgin Islands. He said, I just met with the president of the Virgin Islands. No, you just met with the governor. You're the president. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. I mean, this whole thing it's like we have somebody's drunk uncle as president of the United States. And I'm really concerned about North Korea and the fact that this guy has his finger on the nuclear button. But let's not act like Donald Trump isn't saying things that have been believed by a hell of a lot of American presidents throughout history. He is.
How happy are you that Chief of Staff Kelly is on the job? It's a four-star general who might not normally be your cup of tea, but at least he seems like an adult.
I think if you look at General John Kelly, you look at General James Mattis, and Rex Tillerson to an extent, these guys are within the traditionally accepted norms of American politics, and that's why the Democrats never go to town on them. They're not going to attack them. But let's be clear here. Rex Tillerson is running the State Department the same way he ran ExxonMobil, and he's essentially trying to turn the U.S. government into a for-profit entity. Is he going to sign off on some nuking of North Korea? No, probably not. And that's why I think people say, oh, he's one of the adults in the room. General Kelly his track record at Southern Command in the U.S. is a very xenophobic, kind of anti-immigrant activist, but he comes out of a very disciplined military background, and I think that is probably some mild form of a check on Donald Trump. But let's be clear here. Kelly, Mattis, Mike Pence, these are dangerous people who have deep connections to the neoconservative movement in the United States. I don't know that it would be any better if Mike Pence was in power. It might even be worse.
How would it be worse?
Mike Pence is a right-wing Christian supremacist. He has a medieval view of women's rights. If you look at his record as governor of the state of Indiana, he really tried to criminalize abortion, not just for women who got abortions, but for doctors who perform them. We have doctors assassinated in the United States who perform abortion. Mike Pence, his rhetoric, his time in office, feeds into that same system. Mike Pence is very close to the creator of Blackwater, the mercenary company that I wrote a book about. And he is one of Dick Cheney's chosen kind of apostles to carry on the mantle of Cheney's life work in the neoconservative movement.
So
he's much smarter than Trump with the political game. Trump doesn't know anything about how Congress works. Mike Pence was the chair of the Republican Study Committee. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's like, be careful what you wish for.
Well, I was going to say, but those who want Trump impeached, maybe just take a chill pill?
Well, yeah, I would say that. What do you think comes after that? Okay, you get Trump down. Now what do you have? You have President Mike Pence. I mean, and Mike Pence is a dangerous figure. If you're a woman in America, I would fear Mike Pence becoming president of the United States. If you're a man who cares about women, I would fear it. And that's not even talking about foreign policy.
Here is something that was written by trans activist Kai Cheng on Medium this past August. Sheldon, let's bring this graphic up if you could. There are many leftist and marginalized folks who are not always comfortable with the direction of the social justice left, and in particular, its focus on increasingly fragmented identity politics and the performance of virtue. In fact, most of what I do now when hanging out with friends, quote unquote, in the community, is complain about the dynamics of, quote unquote, the community. We've heard a lot of talk about this. Michael Sandel from Harvard was on our program not too long ago. Mark Lila from Columbia, talking about a fragmented Democratic Party left in the United States that is obsessed with identity politics, which is a guaranteed continual path to electoral oblivion. Are you with them?
No, I mean, I think a lot of the critique of so-called identity politics coming from white people is that it's politics they can't identify with. And I said quite clearly to you a few moments ago, I believe that America remains a racist country. And I think part of dismantling that means that you have to be aware of the politics of race, gender, sexual orientation, economic status as part of your analysis. I think, in fact, the Democratic Party, one of its great failures has been not to listen to the base of black people that provide one of its largest unified voting blocks. Where I think this stuff gets complicated is that Hillary Clinton's candidacy resulted in a bifurcation of the Democratic Party in an almost official way. You've got the Bernie camp and the Hillary camp. The Hillary camp is more sort of viewed as the identity politics camp than Bernie's. Bernie's is more of like he has the radicals, he has the sectarians, and then he has the people that are disaffected by the politics of the Democratic Party. I think it's a mistake to think of everything through the lens of organized politics because the American system is set up in such a way that what you can accomplish is very limited through institutional politics under a two-party system. But I think, no, I think it is very important to listen to people who are engaged in struggle that they didn't choose, that chose them because of our system. And that means people of various sexual orientations, gender identity, and race.
International affairs. In August, before Trump's speech on Afghanistan, you wrote the following. Years from now, when honest historians and scholars examine the Trump moment, it is certain that among the greatest beneficiaries of his presidency will be the military and the CIA. Jeremy, why'd you write that?
Well, if you look at what's happening now in the context of Trump-Russia, the whole investigation, is there a P tape? Was there money exchanged? Was there some quid pro quo with Vladimir Putin? The prominent Democrats and their liberal base of supporters on social media are portraying the CIA as the good guys who are going to keep us safe from Trump. The FBI is now this heroic institution in the United States. James Comey, terrible civil liberties, civil rights record as director of the FBI. Robert Mueller, who's leading the independent investigation, atrocious record in the 1990s on core issues that liberals and leftists supposedly care about, are now being heralded as the people that are going to save us from Trump. So on the one hand, the CIA is going through this, and the FBI, this glory era where the Democrats are heaping praise on them. On the other side of it, you've got this nincompoop as president of the United States who defers to the generals, who puts a radical ideologue over at the CIA. They're running the deck, man. They're getting everything that they want because the Democrats love them right now for political reasons. And Trump doesn't know how to effectively oversee these organizations from his perch in the executive branch. So the CIA and the military are largely getting everything that they want, and the Democrats have totally laid off of investigating anything they're doing.
Okay, fair to say, however, that Barack Obama was the guy who took the drone program, the drone, assassination by drone program, and turned it into a huge thing.
And got liberals in the United States. At one point, 70% of self-identified liberals said they were okay with drone strikes around the world, and it only changed negligibly when the question was an American citizen being killed in a drone strike under Obama. He groomed liberals to love war
because they trusted him.
Oh yeah,
but now the program is in the hands of Donald Trump.
And
so
Trump
now
wants
what?
to expand it. And you know what? One of the greatest failures of Barack Obama was that he left a system for Donald Trump that has no effective oversight or ability to be investigated, and it's carte blanche now. It's war on the world stuff. He set Trump up for this. That's why you can't just start history with Donald Trump any more than you could have started it with George Bush after 9/11. Obama is part of what Trump is doing in the world right now, and he needs to own that. He's not some resistance figure here. He teed him up pretty nicely to be, a war on the world's guy.
You are, if I may say, one of the leading figures in journalism in the world today. And
Wow.
to that
I'm gonna
end,
put that on my.
you can put it on your tombstone,
I
or put it
paid
on
him.
your resume,
No,
whatever
yeah,
you like.
there you go, thanks.
But you will have left footprints by the time you're done doing this. And let's quote from Hunter S. Thompson in an interview he did 20 years ago with The Atlantic to talk about journalism in our remaining moments here. "I don't get any satisfaction out of the old traditional journalist view." This is Hunter S. Thompson. "I just covered the story. I just gave it a balanced view. Objective journalism is one of the main reasons American politics has been allowed to be so corrupt for so long. You can't be objective about Nixon. How can you be objective about Clinton?" Do you share the belief that for journalists to really leave their mark and be great, we ought to just dispense with this objectivity business?
I don't think it's a requirement for journalists to be great, but I do think it's more than a coincidence that a lot of the greatest journalists dispense with the notion that they're supposed to be objective. Very briefly, objectivity, in my experience, often is used as a hammer to try to smash anyone who says that Caesar shouldn't have his say, that the state shouldn't have sort of the ultimate last word in setting the narrative. And it's used to kind of attack people and say, well, you're an activist or you have an agenda, when they're being transparent about their views. Most important things to me in journalism: get your facts straight, provide people information they can use to make informed decision, give voice to the voiceless, hold those in power accountable. That to me is good journalism.
Afflict the comfortable, comfort the afflicted.
Yep, as Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker, herself a former journalist, said.
You come from the sort of Catholic liberation theology tradition, do you not?
Yeah, it's funny. Whenever I debate, right-wing Christian evangelicals, I think they're shocked to find that I'm a biblically literate person. I think they think I'm some horrid, atheist that's never read the Bible or anything. And I come out of the tradition of the Catholic Worker movement, which is an anarchist pacifist movement in the U.S.
And that informs your journalism?
Absolutely. I mean, I believe also. I spent years of my life working in homeless shelters. I believe that good journalism also is in the service of the works of mercy, that you are standing with the poor and the oppressed, and that's part of, I think, what our job as journalists should be, is to stand with the people. As Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, said, when asked whose side are you on in Vietnam, he said, "I'm on the side of the people being burned." And if you think about that, it's a profound statement, and I think it's a challenge to all of us as journalists. We should be on the side of the people that are being burned.
In our last minute, then, help us understand why the American media right now is in the crosshairs as never before. Fake news, there is a lack of trust, there's a lack of so much in what the legacy media in the United States do right now. Why is that?
I think part of this was strategic. I think Steve Bannon studied Joseph Goebbels, literally. I think he studied Joseph Goebbels' playbook, and the Luftwaffe, the idea of the fake press has been used by dictators and despots throughout history. So part of it, I think, is strategic, and part of it is that we have a very thin-skinned president who has his Twitter barrel always loaded and ready to fire. But it's dangerous. It's not just a joke. It's not just, oh, look what this idiot tweeted today. Look how he doesn't spell. Look how he doesn't know the president, that he's the president of this island that it's a U.S. territory. It's dangerous. When you start talking about taking away licenses of broadcasters, it's not that I'm a fan of NBC. When they come, the first person that they come for or institution that they come for is going to be the beginning of a war. And that's why I think we would all need to stand in open defiance of any attempts to take the license away from any news organization based on political considerations.
Jeremy, we're grateful that you could spare so much time for us tonight here on TVO. We also want to thank the Hot Docs Podcast Festival for getting you up here and loaning you to us today. A really fine festival that brings so many great guests to town.
I'm putting your quote on my T-shirt next time. We're going to sell them at theintercept.com. No.
Good, yes. Best of luck with everything, and thanks
Thank you very
again.
much. It's a pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.